The story begins without urgency, without raised voices or sudden movement, because history itself rarely announces when it is about to change the world. On a quiet morning in the late summer of 1816, the town of New Harmony, Indiana, woke exactly as it always had. The Ohio River moved slowly past its banks, carrying with it pieces of driftwood, patches of mist, and the unspoken weight of centuries. Farmers rose before the sun, chickens scratched at the dirt. The wooden floors of small houses creaked as families began another ordinary day. Nothing about this place suggested it would one day be remembered, and nothing about the people living there believed they were standing inside history. Yet, unknown to them, this town and others like it were part of a much larger, quieter story. A story shaped not by kings or wars, but by paperwork, forgotten experiments, financial desperation, and human boredom. To understand how such ordinary lives became connected to one of the most astonishing yet rarely discussed chapters of American history, one must step backward, not dramatically, but patiently. Long before Indiana became a state, before the United States even imagined itself stretching westward, Europe was wrestling with a different kind of problem. It was not hunger, nor war, nor plague, though all three existed, but something far more subtle. Europe was running out of patience. By the end of the 18th century, centuries-old systems were cracking under their own weight. Monarchies still ruled, but belief in divine right had grown thin. Churches still preached certainty, but doubt crept quietly into educated minds. Philosophers spoke endlessly of reason, progress, and order, yet the lives of ordinary people felt increasingly chaotic. Factories rose, cities expanded, time itself became measured more strictly, divided into shifts, hours, wages, and debts. Life moved faster, yet satisfaction did not follow. Among merchants, scholars, and civil servants, a peculiar exhaustion spread, an exhaustion not of the body, but of meaning. And it was from this exhaustion that an idea emerged, not loudly, not violently, but persistently. What if society itself could be redesigned, not reformed slowly, but rebuilt methodically, rationally, quietly? This idea did not belong to revolutionaries shouting in the streets. It belonged to men who sat at desks for too long, who read too many reports, who calculated costs until numbers lost their humanity. One of those men was Robert Owen. Owen was not born poor, nor was he born noble. He was born into the narrow middle space where ambition thrives. A Welshman by birth, Owen believed deeply that human behavior was shaped by environment. Change the environment, he argued, and people would naturally become better, kinder, more productive. It was not an emotional belief, it was a managerial one. Owen did not dream of overthrowing governments, he dreamed of efficiency. Factories, he believed, could be humane, communities could be organized, education could eliminate crime, poverty could be erased, not by charity, but by structure. To Owen, this was not radical, it was obvious. But Europe was old, crowded, and resistant. Land was scarce, traditions were immovable, and so Owen's gaze drifted westward, across the Atlantic, to a young nation that still felt unfinished. America, in the early 1800s, was less a country and more a concept. It was open space, legal ambiguity, and optimism stitched together by fragile institutions. To men like Owen, America did not look wild, it looked available. In 1825, Owen purchased the town of New Harmony, Indiana, from a German religious group known as the Harmonists. They had built the town with discipline and order, then abandoned it in search of spiritual purity elsewhere. Owen saw opportunity. He did not rename the town. He did not rebuild it dramatically. He simply invited people, scientists, teachers, artisans, thinkers, to come live there and help build a rational society. No private property, shared labor, equal education, calm order. It was, on paper, perfect. And this is where the story becomes strange, not because it failed, many experiments fail, but because of who came, why they stayed, and what quietly unfolded in the months that followed. New Harmony attracted people who were tired, not physically tired, but deeply bored with the existing world. They came not seeking adventure, but relief. Among them were former clergymen who no longer believed their sermons, intellectuals who could not find positions in established universities, women who wanted education without apology, and men who had read too much philosophy to return comfortably to ordinary life. They arrived by riverboat, carrying trunks of books, instruments, and expectations that could not all be fulfilled. At first, life was gentle. Meals were shared, lectures were common, children were educated without punishment. There were no whips, no chains, no screaming overseers. For a moment, it seemed as though boredom itself had been cured. But boredom, it turns out, is adaptable. As weeks turned into months, subtle problems emerged. Who decided what work mattered? Who cleaned the latrines? Who enforced rules in a society designed to eliminate enforcement? Owen believed reason would handle these questions. Reason, however, is slow, and human nature is not. Small resentments formed. Intellectual arguments replaced physical labor. Committees met endlessly. Decisions were postponed in the name of fairness. The town did not collapse dramatically. It drifted. And while New Harmony struggled quietly, something else was happening across America, something less idealistic, less thoughtful, and far more successful. The United States government, still young and deeply bureaucratic, was building systems. Land offices, census records, postal routes, surveys. Paperwork expanded westward faster than people did. Maps were drawn of places no one had seen. Boundaries were defined before communities existed. Numbers were collected, filed, and forgotten. History textbooks often focus on wars and presidents, but most of America was built by clerks, men who never fired a weapon, never gave a speech, never imagined their work would matter. They measured, they recorded, they waited. And it was within this waiting, this institutional boredom, that one of the most astonishing administrative experiments in history quietly took shape. But to understand it, we must leave New Harmony for now and follow the paperwork. Because while idealists tried to redesign human nature, the government was accidentally redesigning time itself. And it did so without anyone paying much attention at all. While New Harmony slowly unraveled under the weight of its own idealism, the machinery of the United States government continued to move with a steadiness that few people noticed and even fewer questioned. In Washington City, still muddy, unfinished, and often unimpressive to visitors, clerks arrived at their desks each morning with ink-stained fingers and predictable routines. They sharpened quills, arranged ledgers, and copied numbers from one column to another. There was nothing heroic in their work, and that was precisely why it mattered. Among these clerks was a man named Jeremiah Whittlesey. Whittlesey was not remarkable. He was not ambitious in the way biographies prefer. He did not write letters predicting the future, nor did he complain loudly about the present. He simply showed up, performed his duties carefully, and returned to his boarding house at the same hour each evening. His task, like that of many others, involved land records. By the early 19th century, the federal government had inherited a problem that grew larger every year. Land existed in vast quantities, but understanding it required systems. Plots had to be measured, claims had to be recorded, disputes had to be resolved, quietly, methodically, and preferably without violence. So the government did what it did best. It standardized. Land was divided into townships, townships into sections, sections into parcels. Everything was given a number. Everything was filed. And because America was expanding faster than its institutions could comfortably manage, mistakes were inevitable. Numbers were copied incorrectly, boundaries overlapped, names were misspelled, entire settlements were recorded twice, or not at all. Most of these errors were small, inconvenient, but forgettable. One error, however, was not. It began in 1803, shortly after the Louisiana Purchase, a transaction so large and abstract that no one truly understood its physical reality. Millions of acres changed hands with a signature. Forests, rivers, plains, and future cities were absorbed into paperwork overnight. Surveyors were dispatched westward with chains, compasses, and instructions that assumed the land itself would cooperate. It did not. Rivers curved unpredictably. Magnetic compasses drifted. Survey lines met terrain that defied straight edges, and so compromises were made. One such compromise created a parcel of land that technically existed on paper but could not be located precisely on the ground. It was not missing, it was ambiguous. And ambiguity, when recorded officially, becomes a kind of ghost. This parcel, later referred to in internal documents as Lot 17B, was entered into federal records with coordinates that conflicted with surrounding surveys. No one noticed immediately. Why would they? It was 1 square mile among millions. Years passed. Lot 17B was taxed, then untaxed, then reassigned. Its ownership shifted between agencies. At one point, it was marked as improved, though no description of improvements was recorded. Later, it was listed as vacant. No one ever visited it. And yet, it appeared in reports year after year. Clerks like Whittlesey noticed inconsistencies occasionally, but correcting them required time, approvals, and justification. It was easier to copy the previous year's entry and move on. Bureaucracy does not create mysteries deliberately, it preserves them. By the 1820s, similar phantom entries existed across federal records. Roads that ended nowhere, forts that were never built, towns that appeared briefly in censuses before vanishing entirely. Most of these anomalies were dismissed as clerical errors, but together they formed a pattern that no one recognized because no one was looking for patterns. America, at that time, was obsessed with progress, not coherence. Meanwhile, back in New Harmony, progress had stalled. Robert Owen, growing frustrated, attempted to restructure the community repeatedly. New constitutions were written, new committees formed, rules were revised. Each change created more discussion, more meetings, and less actual work. People began to leave, not angrily, quietly. They drifted away, downriver or eastward, carrying with them disappointment and vague explanations. Some wrote essays, others simply resumed ordinary lives and avoided the topic entirely. New Harmony did not fail spectacularly enough to be remembered as a warning. It failed softly, and soft failures rarely make it into textbooks. But among those who left was a man named Elias Mercer, whose departure would matter later in ways he could not anticipate it. Mercer had come to New Harmony as a teacher. He believed cautiously in Owen's ideas, but was not devoted to them. What fascinated Mercer more than communal living was observation. He paid attention to systems, habits, and unintended consequences. In New Harmony, he noticed something subtle. Without private property, people argued endlessly over responsibility. Without hierarchy, Decisions slowed. Without boredom's usual outlets, ambition, competition, and status, boredom intensified. People did not become violent, they became distracted. Mercer left New Harmony and accepted a position in a federal land office in Ohio, a job that paid little but offered stability. His task involved cross-referencing claims and resolving discrepancies, exactly the kind of work most people avoided. Mercer did not. He found it calming. Day after day, he reviewed maps, surveys, and ownership histories. Patterns emerged, not traumatic ones, but recurring irregularities. Certain parcels appeared repeatedly in disputes, not because anyone wanted them, but because no one understood them. Lot 17B was one of them. Mercer flagged it. He wrote a memo, short, careful, unemotional, suggesting that the parcel's coordinates be verified. The memo was filed, acknowledged, and ignored. Not out of malice, out of fatigue. The land office was understaffed, surveyors were expensive, and there were always more urgent matters. Settlers demanding titles, speculators demanding speed, politicians demanding numbers. Lot 17B remained unresolved. Years later, a census enumerator named Thomas Caldwell encountered something odd while conducting household counts near the Indiana-Illinois border. A settlement appeared where no settlement was recorded. It was small, a few dozen structures, families that seemed to know each other but did not appear in previous census records. They were polite, cooperative, and usually indifferent to official questions. When Caldwell asked about land titles, the answers were vague. "We've always been here," one man said. Caldwell noted the settlement, recorded approximate numbers, and moved on. He had quotas to meet. The settlement was not named. It was simply listed as unincorporated. Back in Washington, clerks reconciled census data with land records. The unnamed settlement corresponded, loosely, to the coordinates of Lot 17B. The discrepancy was noted in the margin of a ledger. No action followed. America was growing faster than its attention span. And so, without intention or design, a place existed that was officially undefined. A place that appeared in documents but not on maps, taxed inconsistently, governed ambiguously, and rarely visited by authority. It was not lawless, it was overlooked. And overlooked places develop habits that regulated places do not. Generations passed. The unnamed settlement persisted quietly, absorbing people who arrived without questions and releasing few who left with answers. It was not a refuge for criminals, nor a utopia. It was something duller and stranger. It was administratively invisible. While the nation fought wars, expanded railroads, and argued over slavery and industry, this place remained unchanged, not because it resisted history, but because history forgot to include it. By the time the Civil War erupted, no military maps marked it, no regiments marched through it, no battles disturbed it. Soldiers passed nearby, never knowing the settlement existed. Paper protected it, and boredom preserved it. After the war, America modernized rapidly. Telegraphs, railroads, and standardized time zones reshaped daily life. The government became more efficient, more centralized, and more confident in its records. Old discrepancies were meant to be corrected, but correcting them required acknowledging them. Lot 17B still sat in the files. It had become inconvenient, and inconvenient truths are often buried beneath new procedures. By the late 19th century, land records were... While New Harmony slowly unraveled under the weight of its own idealism, the machinery of the United States government continued to move with a steadiness that few people noticed and even fewer questioned. In Washington City, still muddy, unfinished, and often unimpressive to visitors, Clerks arrived at their desks each morning with ink-stained fingers and predictable routines. They sharpened quills, arranged ledgers, and copied numbers from one column to another. There was nothing heroic in their work, and that was precisely why it mattered. Among these clerks was a man named Jeremiah Whittlesey. Whittlesey was not remarkable. He was not ambitious in the way biographies prefer. He did not write letters predicting the future, nor did he complain loudly about the present. He simply showed up, performed his duties carefully, and returned to his boarding house at the same hour each evening. His task, like that of many others, involved land records. By the early 19th century, the federal government had inherited a problem that grew larger every year. Land existed in vast quantities, but understanding it required systems. Plots had to be measured, claims had to be recorded, disputes had to be resolved, quietly, methodically, and preferably without violence. So the government did what it did best. It standardized. Land was divided into townships, townships into sections, sections into parcels. Everything was given a number. Everything was filed. And because America was expanding faster than its institutions could comfortably manage, mistakes were inevitable. Numbers were copied incorrectly, boundaries overlapped, names were misspelled. Entire settlements were recorded twice or not at all. Most of these errors were small, inconvenient, but forgettable. One error, however, was not. It began in 1803, shortly after the Louisiana Purchase, a transaction so large and abstract that no one truly understood its physical reality. Millions of acres changed hands with a signature. Forests, rivers, plains, and future cities were absorbed into paperwork overnight. Surveyors were dispatched westward with chains, compasses, and instructions that assumed the land itself would cooperate. It did not. Rivers curved unpredictably. Magnetic compasses drifted. Survey lines met terrain that defied straight edges, and so compromises were made. One such compromise created a parcel of land that technically existed on paper but could not be located precisely on the ground. It was not missing, it was ambiguous. And ambiguity, when recorded officially, becomes a kind of ghost. This parcel, later referred to in internal documents as Lot 17B, was entered into federal records with coordinates that conflicted with surrounding surveys. No one noticed immediately. Why would they? It was 1 square mile among millions. Years passed. Lot 17B was taxed, then untaxed, then reassigned. Its ownership shifted between agencies. At one point, it was marked as improved, though no description of improvements was recorded. Later, it was listed as vacant. No one ever visited it, and yet it appeared in reports year after year. Clerks like Whittlesey noticed inconsistencies occasionally, but correcting them required time, approvals, and justification. It was easier to copy the previous year's entry and move on. Bureaucracy does not create mysteries deliberately. It preserves them. By the 1820s, similar phantom entries existed across federal records. Roads that ended nowhere, forts that were never built, towns that appeared briefly in censuses before vanishing entirely. Most of these anomalies were dismissed as clerical errors, but together they formed a pattern that no one recognized because no one was looking for patterns. America at that time was obsessed with progress, not coherence. Meanwhile, back in New Harmony, progress had stalled. Robert Owen, growing frustrated, attempted to restructure the community repeatedly. New constitutions were written, new committees formed, rules were revised. Each change created more discussion, more meetings, and less actual work. People began to leave, not angrily, quietly.
They drifted away downriver or eastward, carrying with them disappointment and vague explanations. Some wrote essays, others simply resumed ordinary lives and avoided the topic entirely. New Harmony did not fail spectacularly enough to be remembered as a warning. It failed softly, and soft failures rarely make it into textbooks. But among those who left was a man named Elias Mercer, whose departure would matter later in ways he could not anticipate it. Mercer had come to New Harmony as a teacher. He believed cautiously in Owen's ideas, but was not devoted to them. What fascinated Mercer more than communal living was observation. He paid attention to systems, habits, and unintended consequences. In New Harmony, he noticed something subtle. Without private property, people argued endlessly over responsibility. Without hierarchy, decisions slowed. Without boredom's usual outlets, ambition, competition, status, boredom intensified. People did not become violent, they became distracted. Mercer left New Harmony and accepted a position in a federal land office in Ohio, a job that paid little but offered stability. His task involved cross-referencing claims and resolving discrepancies, exactly the kind of work most people avoided. Mercer did not. He found it calming. Day after day, he reviewed maps, surveys, and ownership histories. Patterns emerged, not dramatic ones, but recurring irregularities. Certain parcels appeared repeatedly in disputes, not because anyone wanted them, but because no one understood them. Lot 17B was one of them. Mercer flagged it. He wrote a memo, short, careful, unemotional, suggesting that the parcel's coordinates be verified. The memo was filed, acknowledged, and ignored. Not of malice, out of fatigue. The land office was understaffed, surveyors were expensive, and there were always more urgent matters. Settlers demanding titles, speculators demanding speed, politicians demanding numbers. Lot 17B remained unresolved. Years later, a census enumerator named Thomas Caldwell encountered something odd while conducting household counts near the Indiana-Illinois border. A settlement appeared where no settlement was recorded. It was small, a few dozen structures, families that seemed to know each other but did not appear in previous census records. They were polite, cooperative, and unusually indifferent to official questions. When Caldwell asked about land titles, the answers were vague. "We've always been here," one man said. Caldwell noted the settlement, recorded approximate numbers, and moved on. He had quotas to meet. The settlement was not named. It was simply listed as unincorporated. Back in Washington, clerks reconciled census data with land records. The unnamed settlement corresponded loosely to the coordinates of Lot 17B. The discrepancy was noted in the margin of a ledger. No action followed. America was growing faster than its attention span. And so, without intention or design, a place existed that was officially undefined. A place that appeared in documents, but not on maps, taxed inconsistently, governed ambiguously, and rarely visited by authority. It was not lawless, it was overlooked. And overlooked places develop habits that regulated places do not. Generations passed. The unnamed settlement persisted quietly, absorbing people who arrived without questions and releasing few who left with answers. It was not a refuge for criminals, nor utopia. It was something duller and stranger. It was administratively invisible. While the nation fought wars, expanded railroads, and argued over slavery and industry, this place remained unchanged, not because it resisted history, but because history forgot to include it. By the time the Civil War erupted, no military maps marked it, no regiments marched through it, no battles disturbed it. Soldiers passed by, never knowing the settlement existed. Paper protected it, and boredom preserved it. After the war, America modernized rapidly. Telegraphs, railroads, and standardized time zones reshaped daily life. The government became more efficient, more centralized, and more confident in its records. Old discrepancies were meant to be corrected, but correcting them required acknowledging them. Lot 17B still sat in the files. It had become inconvenient, and inconvenient truths are often buried beneath new procedures. By the late 19th century,
Discovery, when it finally arrived, did not come with sirens or headlines. It arrived the way most modern realizations do, quietly, through a software update. In the early years of the 21st century, federal and state agencies began integrating their databases. Land records, census data, tax rolls, and satellite imagery were layered together in ways that had never existed before. The intention was efficiency. Redundancy would be eliminated. Errors would be corrected. No one expected surprises. During one such integration, an automated reconciliation process flagged a geographic anomaly. The system detected a population density cluster that did not correspond to any recognized municipal entity. It was not labeled as an error, but as an unclassified zone. Unclassified zones were uncommon, but not unknown. Most were temporary, construction sites, industrial complexes, or recently annexed areas awaiting updates. This one was different. It had a population history stretching back decades. The anomaly was escalated, not because it seemed dangerous, but because it was persistent. A mid-level analyst named Karen Liu was assigned to investigate. Liu was experienced, careful, and accustomed to resolving inconsistencies. She expected a simple explanation. She did not find one. Every dataset told a partial story. Census records suggested continuity. Tax records were inconsistent but existent. School enrollments appeared under neighboring districts. Emergency services logs showed occasional responses, though addresses were often vague. Satellite imagery confirmed structures, homes, barns, roads. Legally, the land should not have been occupied. Practically, it had been occupied for generations. Liu traced the anomaly back through digitized archives and eventually encountered Lot 17B. The name meant nothing to her at first. As she followed its trail, she experienced a mild but persistent unease. Not fear, but the discomfort of encountering something that did not fit institutional logic. The settlement was not missing. It was misfiled. Correcting the issue would require formal surveys, jurisdictional determinations, tax reassessments, and legal notifications. Residents would need deeds, boundaries would need to be drawn, authority would need to be asserted. Each step carried consequences. Liu prepared a briefing. Her supervisors listened carefully. They asked questions. They consulted legal counsel. They consulted policy experts. The conclusion was cautious. There was no immediate harm, no complaints, no liability claims, no public awareness. The recommendation was to proceed slowly, very slowly. A decision was made to commission a quiet field assessment, non-intrusive, observational, and framed as routine. 2 contractors were sent. They introduced themselves as survey consultants. They asked general questions, they observed infrastructure, they noted conditions. The residents were polite. They answered without volunteering. They were aware, in a diffuse way, that attention had increased. This awareness did not cause panic. It caused adjustment. People ensured their properties appeared orderly. Records were quietly organized. Family histories were discussed. Elders remembered fragments of earlier encounters with officials, rare, brief,
inconclusive. The community had no desire to resist incorporation. It also had no desire to rush it. The contractors submitted their report. It confirmed long-term habitation, functional governance through informal means, and absence of legal titles. The question now shifted from, "Does this place exist?" to, "What is it legally?" That question moved upward. State agencies debated jurisdiction. Federal agencies considered precedent. Legal scholars weighed in quietly. There was no playbook for this. In theory, the land belonged to the state, or possibly the federal government, or possibly no one at all. In practice, families had lived there longer than most surrounding towns. Eviction was unthinkable. Retroactive regularization was complex. Doing nothing was easiest. And so, once again, the system hesitated. But hesitation in the digital age does not freeze time, it merely delays impact. As word spread internally, curiosity grew. A few journalists learned of the anomaly through public records requests. Articles appeared, measured, speculative, and easily overlooked. "A town that time forgot," one headline read. The settlement received visitors, researchers, students, historians. They found nothing sensational, no cult, no conspiracy, just ordinary lives lived with minimal documentation. This disappointed many. Ordinary anomalies are harder to monetize. Yet the story lingered. For historians, the settlement became a case study in administrative neglect and unintended autonomy. For sociologists, it was an example of self-regulation. For legal scholars, it was a headache. For the residents, it was a gradual shift. Forms arrived. Meetings were scheduled. Names were requested. For the place, for the roads, for the community itself. Naming, after so long, felt invasive. They chose a name eventually. Not inspired, not symbolic. It was practical. The name appeared in documents, boundaries were drawn, deeds were issued with careful language acknowledging long-term occupancy. Taxes were standardized, services were formalized. The settlement entered the official world. Nothing dramatic changed immediately, but subtle shifts followed. Expectations adjusted, complaints increased, external authority became a presence rather than an abstraction. Some residents welcomed this. Others mourned something they could not quite articulate. What had been lost was not freedom exactly. It was ambiguity. Ambiguity had allowed patience. It had slowed time. It had discouraged interference. Now, clarity accelerated everything. Children grew up expecting defined pathways. Disputes escalated more readily. Systems replaced conversations. This was not decline, it was normalization. The settlement became a town like many others, and Lot 17B disappeared from records, not erased, but resolved. The story, however, did not end there, because the discovery raised uncomfortable questions. How many other places existed like this? How many anomalies had been absorbed quietly? How much of history had unfolded outside official awareness? The answer was not reassuring. Modern governance depends on completeness, but completeness is an aspiration, not a reality. Even now, systems rely on assumptions inherited from earlier omissions. The unnamed settlement was not unique. It was simply visible enough, eventually, to be noticed. And its existence reminded historians of something deeply unromantic, but profoundly true. History is not shaped only by decisions. It is shaped by delays, by the things that seem unimportant, by the files no one opens, by the boredom that allows errors to persist long enough to become facts. And if one listens closely, in the quiet spaces between records and routines, one can still hear the echo of lives lived without annotation, ordinary, continuous, and largely unremarked, which is how most of history actually happens.
Once the town was named, mapped, and entered into the systems that governed everything from emergency response to insurance premiums, it began to experience a phenomenon familiar to many places but rarely articulated. It began to remember differently. Before incorporation, memory had been communal and informal. Stories passed in fragments, adjusted with repetition. Events mattered only insofar as they shaped habits. Dates were approximate. Causes were less important than outcomes. After incorporation, memory required documentation. Old family Bibles were copied. Oral histories were recorded. Photographs were labeled. Timelines were constructed where none had previously existed. This process did not create falsehoods. It created precision. Precision, in turn, changed meaning. When historians from a nearby university conducted interviews, they noticed inconsistencies, not lies, but variations. One family remembered a schoolhouse built in the 1890s. Another insisted it had always been there. Records suggested construction in 1907, but no permit existed. The historians reconciled these accounts with the assumption that memory degrades over time. What they did not consider was that memory adapts to environment. In a place without oversight, memory does not need to align with official chronology. It needs only to function. Now, alignment was expected. The town council, newly formed and still learning the language of procedure, debated ordinances that would have been unnecessary decades earlier. Noise regulations, zoning categories, property boundaries. Each decision felt heavier than it needed to be. Residents were not opposed to rules. They were simply unaccustomed to permanence. Rules, once written, invite enforcement. Enforcement invites conflict. Conflict accelerates time. Older residents felt this most acutely. They struggled to explain what had changed because nothing obvious had. The roads were the same, the fields unchanged, the faces familiar. Yet something intangible had shifted. They had entered history, not as participants, but as subjects. Local schools adopted standardized curricula. Children learned about federalism, civic duty, and historical case studies that did not include their own town. Teachers attempted to incorporate local history, but struggled to place it within recognized frameworks. "How do we explain ourselves?" one teacher asked. The answer was unsatisfying. You explain what you can document. Documentation, however, lagged behind reality. When property deeds were issued, many were marked with phrases like established occupancy or historic usage acknowledged. These phrases carried legal weight but lacked narrative clarity. They told no story. Journalists revisited the town periodically, each time framing it as a curiosity, America's forgotten community, the town that slipped through the cracks. The residents grew tired of these descriptions. They felt inaccurate, even unfair. They had not been forgotten. They had been left alone. There is a difference. Sociologists noted that crime rates were low, civic participation high, and interpersonal trust unusually strong. These observations were published, cited, and compared. The town became an example. Examples are flattening. They remove texture in favor of conclusion. Residents learned to tolerate this. They had learned over generations to tolerate attention by not responding to it too strongly. Life continued. Children grew up and left. Others stayed. Newcomers arrived, drawn by affordability, curiosity, or accident. The demographic shifted slowly, predictably. Time resumed its ordinary pace. And yet, something remained unresolved, not legally, but philosophically.
What did it mean that a community could exist for so long without being fully known? Historians debated this question in academic journals, usually in footnotes. They referenced administrative inertia, frontier conditions, and institutional blind spots. All were correct, none were complete, because the truth was simpler and less dramatic. The settlement existed because no one needed it not to. Power often reveals itself through action, but just as often through inaction. Decisions made and decisions postponed. Problems addressed and problems deferred. Lot 17B had never threatened anyone. It had never demanded recognition. It had never disrupted systems enough to justify attention, so it was ignored. This pattern repeated across American history in quieter ways. Informal schools, unregistered labor, communities operating parallel to official structures. Most were eventually absorbed. Some were erased. Few were remembered. The town's story entered archives, then textbooks, then lecture slides. It became a paragraph, then a case study, then an anecdote. The residents aged. Some passed away. Their children remembered a time before incorporation as something distant, almost mythical. What had once been daily life became lore. And so the town became what all places become eventually, a memory shaped by those who describe it. In the end, the most astonishing aspect of the story was not the administrative error, nor the longevity of the settlement, nor the delayed recognition. It was the normalcy. Nothing supernatural had protected the place. No ideology had sustained it. No rebellion had defined it. It had persisted through boredom, through the quiet willingness of systems to leave well enough alone, through the human tendency to accept what causes no immediate discomfort. History, when examined closely, is full of such spaces, intervals where nothing urgent occurs, and so nothing is recorded. Yet life continues there, unobserved but complete. And perhaps this is why such stories are difficult to tell loudly. They do not warn, they do not inspire, they simply explain. They explain how much of the past unfolded not in moments of crisis, but in long stretches of administrative silence, in forms left blank, in files never reopened, in communities that lived, slept, worked, and aged without ever knowing they were remarkable, until someone finally noticed. And by then, the most remarkable thing about them was how ordinary they had been all along.
After the town's story had been told enough times to lose its novelty, it began to merge into a larger, quieter category of historical knowledge, the kind that is acknowledged, footnoted, and rarely revisited. This is where most history eventually goes. Once something is explained, even imperfectly, curiosity relaxes. Questions no longer press forward. The narrative becomes sufficient, not because it is complete, but because it no longer causes discomfort. For the town, this meant peace. Visitors became infrequent. Researchers shifted to newer subjects. Journalists stopped calling. The community returned to being just another place on a map, with a past that mattered mostly to itself. But beyond the town's boundaries, the implications of its existence continued to unfold slowly. In government agencies, especially those responsible for infrastructure and emergency planning, a quiet reassessment began. It was not publicized. It did not involve new legislation. It involved checklists. After the discovery of the town, analysts began asking cautious questions. Were there other population clusters with inconsistent documentation? Were there gaps in historical records that had never been reconciled? Were there assumptions embedded in databases that no longer reflected reality?
The answers were predictable. Yes. But knowing this did not lead to immediate action. Action requires prioritization, and prioritization requires urgency. The modern state is excellent at responding to crises. It is less effective at addressing the absence of them. Most anomalies, like the town once was, caused no immediate harm. They did not disrupt commerce. They did not generate complaints. They did not threaten safety. So they remained. In this way, the town's story repeated itself, not as a single anomaly, but as a pattern. In rural areas, informal communities persisted at the edges of documentation. Seasonal populations came and went without leaving consistent records. Migrant housing shifted locations faster than maps could be updated. Urban environments had their own versions, buildings repurposed unofficially, basement apartments unregistered, work conducted beyond regulatory awareness. None of this was secret. It was simply inconvenient to fully integrate. The town had once existed at the intersection of these tendencies, where oversight was technically possible, but practically delayed. Its long invisibility was not a failure of intelligence. It was a consequence of workload. This realization led some historians to reinterpret the town's story, not as an anomaly, but as a representative case, a visible example of something that happened quietly everywhere. History, they argued, is shaped as much by what institutions cannot keep up with as by what they deliberately choose to control. Within the town, life continued with gentle regularity. Seasonal events returned year after year. Harvest festivals, modest parades, school graduations. None were extravagant. None sought attention. People aged into routines rather than milestones. The town's calendar filled with events that repeated so consistently they barely registered as events at all. This repetition had a soothing effect. Visitors sometimes remarked on it. "There's nothing going on here," they would say. Residents nodded. That was the point. Sociologists who studied the town in later years noticed something else as well. Low rates of anxiety-related illness, slower adoption of trends, and a general skepticism towards urgency. These traits were not universal, nor were they idealized. They were simply more common than elsewhere. The researchers attributed this to demographics, environment, and cultural inheritance. All were correct, but none fully accounted for the underlying factor, a historical experience in which delay had not been punished. When people grow up in systems where waiting does not produce immediate consequences, patience becomes rational. Elsewhere, waiting leads to loss, missed deadlines, penalties, exclusion. In the town's past, waiting had preserved autonomy. That memory lingered even after the conditions that created it had disappeared. The town's archives grew slowly. Local historians organized materials into folders, then digitized them. The story of Lot 17B became standardized, condensed, and easier to tell. Condensation is necessary, but something is always lost in the process. What disappeared was not the facts, but the texture, the sense of long, uneventful years during which nothing demanded resolution. This texture is difficult to preserve. It does not photograph well. It does not summarize easily. And yet, it is what most lives consist of. As time passed, fewer residents remembered life before incorporation. The unusual past became something learned, not lived. It was no longer an experience, it was a narrative. Narratives are stable. Experiences are not. Eventually, the town's history appeared in a state curriculum as a short case study in administrative anomalies of the early republic. Students read a paragraph, they answered a question, they moved on. The story became small. This, too, is how history settles. The town remained. The systems that had once overlooked it continued to operate, improved but never complete. And somewhere, in some archive, other Lot 17Bs still existed, unresolved entries, ambiguous zones, records that did not quite align. They caused no trouble. They asked no attention. They waited. History will notice them eventually, or it will not. And in either case, life will continue there, quietly, without announcement. Which is perhaps the most accurate way to understand the past, not as a sequence of events, but as a long accumulation of ordinary days, most of which pass without being recorded. The town's story, told slowly enough, does not disrupt sleep. It invites it, because it suggests a world where not everything needs to be resolved immediately, where delay is not always failure, where existence does not require constant verification. And in that suggestion, there is a strange, calming truth.
Long after the town's story had been absorbed into textbooks and databases, long after its former ambiguity had been resolved into neat lines and official language, traces of its earlier condition continued to surface in unexpected places, not in archives, but in behavior. One such trace could be seen in how the town responded to change. When new policies arrived, state mandates, federal guidelines, technological updates, the reaction was rarely immediate. Meetings were scheduled, postponed, rescheduled. Discussions unfolded slowly, often circling the same points without urgency. To outsiders, this seemed inefficient. To residents, it felt natural. Change, after all, had never arrived quickly here. It had always come eventually, softened by time. This attitude had practical effects. When a regional development authority proposed a highway expansion that would pass near the town, the response was measured but firm. The town requested environmental assessments, historical impact studies, and extended comment periods. Nothing was rejected outright. Nothing was approved quickly. The project was delayed long enough that funding priorities shifted elsewhere. The highway was rerouted. No celebration followed. The outcome was not framed as a victory. It was simply how things unfolded. Such episodes accumulated quietly. Over time, the town developed a reputation, not for resistance, but for inertia. Developers learned that projects there required patience. Policymakers learned that deadlines softened when they crossed the town's boundaries. This reputation was not cultivated intentionally. It emerged. Reputations, like histories, often do. Within families, stories of earlier generations were told in a similarly unhurried way. There were no dramatic ancestors, no founding heroes. Instead, there were routines remembered. A grandfather who fixed clocks without caring much for accuracy. An aunt who ran a small store without ever expanding it. A neighbor who attended meetings without speaking much. These stories lacked narrative peaks. They lingered. For children growing up in the town, this shaped expectations subtly. Achievement was not dismissed, but it was not glorified. Careers developed gradually,
Ambitions were adjusted to fit circumstances rather than override them. Some left, seeking faster rhythms elsewhere. Many returned. Those who returned often remarked on the difference in time. Not the clocks, they matched everywhere, but the experience of it. Days felt longer, weeks less compressed. Sociologists struggled to quantify this sensation. They measured commute times, leisure hours, productivity. None fully captured what residents described. The explanation lay deeper, in history that had trained people not to expect immediate responses. This conditioning did not make the town immune to modern pressures. Health crises still occurred, political disagreements still divided, but reactions were dampened. Urgency did not cascade as quickly. In the broader American landscape, this made the town unusual, but not unique. There were other places with similar traits: isolated valleys, aging industrial towns, rural enclaves. What distinguished this town was not geography or economy, it was administrative ancestry. For more than a century, the town had existed in a space where attention arrived slowly, inconsistently, and often incompletely. That experience had left an imprint. Even after formalization, the imprint remained. In the late 2020s, as governments increasingly relied on predictive analytics and real-time monitoring, the town presented a mild challenge. Data models struggled to account for its patterns. Response times were irregular. Participation rates fluctuated. Nothing was wrong, but nothing was optimized either. Analysts adjusted parameters. They expanded tolerance ranges. The town became an outlier, not significant enough to warrant intervention, but persistent enough to resist assimilation into averages. Outliers are uncomfortable. They remind systems of their limits. The town did this quietly, without intention. Residents rarely thought of themselves as exceptional. When asked about their history, they offered polite summaries. When pressed, they shrugged. It was just how things were, they said. This phrase captured more truth than they realized. History is often less about what happened than about how it was allowed to continue. The town's earlier invisibility had not required active defense. It had required only that no one insist on resolution. This condition is rare, but not impossible. It arises when complexity meets fatigue, when attention is finite, when systems prioritize crises over coherence. As time moved forward, the town's story became less about its origins and more about its after-effects. Scholars wrote less about Lot 17b and more about cultural lag, institutional memory, and the psychology of delayed governance. The town itself faded from focus. This was appropriate. Its significance had never been about itself. It had been about the space around it, the gap between intention and implementation, between record and reality. Such gaps still exist. They always will. And in those gaps, life unfolds at its own pace, largely unobserved, shaped not by design, but by duration. The town, now fully ordinary, continued to exist as proof, not that systems fail, but that they are human. And human systems, no matter how advanced, will always leave room for quiet, unremarked continuity, which, when described slowly enough, becomes a kind of lullaby, a reminder that not everything moves at the same speed, that some histories are meant to be told softly, and that in the long, unrecorded stretches of time, people lived their lives without needing to be noticed at all.
By the time the town reached what records officially labeled its modern era, the distinction between its unusual past and its ordinary present had blurred almost completely. New residents arrived with no awareness of Lot 17B, no sense that the streets beneath their feet had once lacked legal definition. They learned the town's name, memorized the road layout, paid their taxes, and settled into routines indistinguishable from those of countless other small American towns. This was not loss, it was completion. Every anomaly, if left undisturbed long enough, eventually becomes normal. The town's integration into regional systems progressed quietly. Emergency services synchronized fully. Property databases aligned. Utility grids were modernized. Broadband arrived, late but eventually reliable. With connectivity came acceleration. Information moved faster than habit. Residents adapted unevenly. Younger generations adopted new rhythms quickly. Older ones remained cautious. The difference was visible in small choices, how quickly messages were answered, how often calendars were checked, how tightly schedules were kept. Yet even as technology compressed time, the town retained a softness around deadlines. Meetings still ran long, decisions still rested overnight. Silence was not immediately filled. This quiet resistance to immediacy had no manifesto. It did not need one. Elsewhere, scholars continued to reference the town occasionally, though with diminishing enthusiasm. New case studies emerged. New anomalies were discovered. The town slipped backward in academic relevance. This too was appropriate. Its role had been fulfilled. It had demonstrated clearly and without spectacle that history could occur outside attention, and that such history left traces not in monuments, but in pace. In one later study, a researcher compared stress markers across several rural communities. The town ranked lower than expected. The researcher attributed this to lifestyle, environment, and social cohesion. All were factors, but the underlying reason remained historical. When a community's existence has never depended on immediate validation, anxiety diminishes. This does not eliminate hardship, it reframes it. In the town, problems were not solved faster, they were absorbed more gradually. Time was allowed to do work that elsewhere was demanded of systems. This approach did not scale. It could not be exported easily. It belonged to a specific sequence of circumstances that could not be replicated intentionally. Attempts to recreate such communities elsewhere failed, as they always do. Design cannot substitute for accident. The town had not been planned, it had been overlooked. And oversight, once institutionalized, changes everything. As decades passed, the town aged in the way all places do. Buildings were replaced, roads resurfaced, businesses opened and closed. Only rarely did someone pause and reflect on how improbable it all was. When they did, the feeling was not pride, it was mild curiosity. How did this even happen, they would ask. The answers were always the same. Slowly, quietly, without urgency. These words described not only the town's past, but its continuing presence. History in this telling did not arrive as a series of shocks. It seeped. It accumulated. It left residues. And those residues shaped behavior long after their origins were forgotten. In this way, the town became less a story and more a condition,
a demonstration of how absence of attention can be as formative as its presence. This idea extended beyond geography. It applied to institutions, relationships, cultures. Much of what exists persists not because it is supported, but because it is not challenged. The town had benefited from this dynamic. It had also been defined by it. And now, as the world outside accelerated further, driven by data, immediacy, and constant revision, the town's quiet endurance took on a new quality. It became a contrast, not a protest, a reference point. For those who noticed it, the town suggested that life could unfold differently, not better or worse, but slower. This suggestion had value, not enough to change systems, but enough to soothe individuals. And perhaps that is why the story, when told in this way, invites rest. It does not demand interpretation. It does not insist on meaning. It simply describes a long series of days that passed without needing to justify themselves. In those days, people woke, worked, spoke, waited, and slept. They did not know they were part of a historical anomaly. They did not need to. History, after all, does not require awareness to occur. It only requires time. And time, in this town, was always given. After the town's story entered academic circulation, it began to change in a way that was almost imperceptible to those living there, but obvious to those observing from a distance. It became settled. Not settled in the geographic sense, that had already happened centuries earlier, but settled in interpretation. The questions surrounding its existence slowly gave way to explanations that felt sufficient, even if they were incomplete. Administrative inertia, frontier ambiguity, bureaucratic delay. These explanations were neat. They allowed the story to rest, and resting stories are rarely disturbed. The town adjusted to its place in the official world. Grants were applied for and sometimes received. Infrastructure improved incrementally. Road names were standardized. Emergency response times shortened. Property values stabilized. Nothing dramatic occurred. This disappointed some of the researchers who had hoped the town would reveal deeper contradictions in governance or society. But drama had never been its nature. The town's power, if it could be called that, had always been its lack of urgency. In daily life, this translated into a pace that outsiders noticed but could not replicate. Conversations lingered. Decisions were postponed without anxiety. There was less pressure to optimize. These traits were not deliberate cultural values. They were residual effects. Generations raised without constant oversight had learned that most things could wait. As the 21st century advanced, the town faced challenges similar to those elsewhere: aging populations, economic shifts, environmental uncertainty. None were unique, none were catastrophic. What was different was how they were processed. Town meetings were longer but calmer. Disagreements rarely escalated. People listened more than they spoke, not out of courtesy, but habit. Habit is history's most durable legacy. In 2016, on the bicentennial of Indiana's statehood, a regional museum requested materials related to the town's early years. The request triggered another wave of archival work. Boxes were opened, letters examined, marginal notes reread. Among them was a faded memo written in careful script, Elias Mercer's original note flagging Lot 17B. It had been misfiled, then rediscovered, then forgotten again. The museum displayed it briefly, accompanied by an explanation that framed it as an early example of administrative oversight. Visitors paused, read, nodded, and moved on. The memo did not feel important. Its language was too restrained. It did not demand attention. And yet, it represented the moment when the story could have ended differently. If Mercer's note had been acted upon decisively, the settlement would have been incorporated early. Its peculiar development would have been prevented, its long, quiet autonomy erased before it fully formed. Instead, the note had joined millions of others, reasonable, accurate, and ignored. This realization unsettled a small number of historians who began to look more closely at similar records. They found many. Across federal archives were traces of places that almost existed, nearly disappeared, or hovered ambiguously between definitions. Most had resolved themselves eventually. Some had not. These discoveries did not change policy. They changed perspective. The idea that governance was comprehensive began to erode subtly. Scholars spoke more openly about blind spots, not as failures, but as inevitabilities. No system, they argued, could see everything, and perhaps it should not try. Within the town, awareness of its unusual past softened into background knowledge. School children learned it as local history. Teenagers found it mildly interesting. Adults referenced it occasionally, usually when explaining bureaucratic frustrations to outsiders. It used to be worse, they would say, meaning better. The phrase was not ironic, it was observational. Older residents passed away quietly, leaving behind objects that carried no labels, tools worn smooth by use, notebooks filled with unstructured thoughts, calendars with empty squares. These items entered estate sales, then thrift stores, then obscurity. History shed its evidence gradually. In time, the town's anomaly faded into normality so completely that new residents were surprised to learn it had ever been unusual at all. "Everything's on the map now," one said. That statement felt reassuring. It was also untrue. Beyond this town, beyond this story, systems continued to operate with assumptions inherited from earlier eras. Digital certainty masked analog uncertainty. Errors persisted beneath layers of correction. Most would never matter. Some already did. But the lesson of the town was not a warning, it was a reminder. That history does not always move forward through decisive moments. Often it drifts. It drifts through afternoons without records, through years without audits, through lives lived without documentation. And when someone eventually looks back and asks how such things were possible, the answer is rarely dramatic. It is procedural, it is boring, and it is human. The town remains, now fully defined, fully governed, fully visible. Yet its past lingers quietly in its rhythms, in the way people wait before responding, in the way silence is tolerated, in the way urgency is mistrusted. These are not traditions taught deliberately. They are residuals of an earlier condition, when existence did not require validation, when life unfolded without constant acknowledgement. And perhaps that is why the story, when told slowly enough, has a calming effect. It describes a world where nothing had to happen immediately, where mistakes were not corrected right away, where time was allowed to pass without explanation. A world that feels distant now, not because it was long ago, but because it no longer fits how systems think. Yet it once existed, quietly, for a very long time. As the town moved further into the 21st century, it became increasingly difficult to distinguish its unique past from the countless ordinary pasts of other places. This difficulty was not accidental. It was the natural end state of prolonged continuity. Uniqueness, unless preserved intentionally, dissolves. The town's records were now complete. Births, deaths, property transfers, zoning adjustments, all documented, archived, and backed up. There were no longer gaps wide enough for life to pass through unnoticed. This completeness brought security. It also brought predictability. Where uncertainty had once slowed life gently, certainty now organized it efficiently. People planned farther ahead, calendars filled, processes tightened. Yet even in this new order, small hesitations remained. A pause before responding, a meeting extended without objection, a deadline softened by consensus. These pauses were rarely discussed. They were not protected by policy or celebrated as tradition. They persisted simply because no one felt compelled to remove them. Habits, once embedded deeply enough, do not require justification. In a regional planning meeting, a consultant once remarked that the town's project timelines consistently exceeded projections. "Nothing ever goes wrong," she said. "It just takes longer." The remark was noted, laughed at gently, and forgotten. In the language of management, this was inefficiency. In the language of lived experience, it was comfort. Children raised in the town grew up with a subtle but enduring sense that time could stretch. They learned that not every question demanded an immediate answer, that silence did not signal failure, and that waiting did not always mean loss. When they left for faster places, some thrived, others returned. Those who returned often struggled to explain why. It was not nostalgia. It was not family obligation. It was relief. The town had never taught them how to succeed quickly. It had taught them how to endure. This distinction mattered with each passing decade. As the wider world accelerated, measuring productivity in milliseconds and value in real time, the town became gently out of sync, not enough to fall behind, but enough to resist full synchronization. This resistance did not make headlines. It did not inspire movements. It existed quietly in the background, like static that never quite disappears. Historians who revisited the town's story in later years framed it differently, no longer as an anomaly, but as an illustration of how systems mature, not by correcting every error, but by absorbing them. Lot 17B, once a problem, had become a footnote. The settlement it sheltered had become a town. The town had become ordinary. And yet, the process by which this occurred remained instructive. It showed that neglect could sometimes function as an incubator, not of rebellion or chaos, but of continuity. It showed that boredom, far from being empty, could be protective. In the absence of urgency, people learned to live with one another rather than over one another. This lesson was not easily applied elsewhere. It depended on timing, scale, and coincidence. It depended on a mistake that was never corrected. As the final elders who remembered the town's ambiguous years passed away, the story lost its last living witnesses. What remained were documents, summaries, and interpretations. The lived experience of unrecognized existence faded completely. Future generations would know it only as history. And history, when separated from experience, becomes calmer, safer, easier to accept. The town continued to exist, not as a symbol, not as a warning, not as a model, but as a place where people lived. They woke to ordinary mornings. They attended ordinary meetings. They experienced ordinary delays. And in those delays, time did what it has always done. It passed, quietly, without asking permission, without requiring attention, which is how the town had begun, and how, in many ways, it had always remained.